Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier listing guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, as part of my ongoing series looking at Baldur's Gate 3 itemization, we're talking about helmets. Specifically, we're talking about the Act 2 helmets, including some of the most broken items in the entire game, and, depending on timing, hopefully the Act 3 helmets as well. Act 2 helmets are probably, in terms of sections of items, like segments of an item slot that you get during a specific act, probably the single biggest power spike that your party will receive, because so many of them are just absolutely game-winning all by themselves, thanks to the prevalence of an incredibly broken mechanic that we'll talk about when we get there. By this point, you've seen a number of these tier lists, and if not, definitely go watch part 1 of this video, where I talk about the Act 1 helmets. So I won't go over all of the tiers again, or how we're approaching rating these items. In fact, we're just going to get right into it and start rating some helmets. First up, the Browbeaten Circlet. The Browbeaten Circlet gives you +1 to your save DC whenever your character is threatened. So, whenever you're in melee range of an enemy with a melee weapon, or fangs, or claws, or whatever. Threatened is a relatively easy condition to apply, of course, because all you have to do is move into melee range of an enemy, and +1 to your save DCs is a pretty powerful effect that most casters will want. Now, Threatened is not necessarily a safe condition to apply for most spellcasters who typically want to avoid being in melee, but if you plan to move into melee range to cast a powerful spell that shuts down the combat, it may not actually matter. You can cast Hypnotic Pattern in melee range just fine, because you intend to have the enemy hypnotized and unable to react afterwards, and then you can just leave. So the Browbeaten Circlet has a play pattern where you can still cast your spells reasonably efficiently, gaining the +1 to save DC. The problem is that it forces you to enter melee, which isn't necessarily possible to do on every spellcaster. Maybe you start further than 30 feet away and can't just walk into melee range of an enemy to gain this bonus. And if your spell fails, then you're in melee range of an enemy who's threatening you, and that is a bad place to be. The other problem with this item is just that it is in competition with a ton of other items that have the same effect. It gives you +1 to your save DCs, which is good. It's a good effect, of course. But by this point in the game, it's Act 2, so you have access to all of the Arcane Acuity helmets if you want them, and those will supersede this, obviously, by giving you +1,000,000 to your save DC, rather than just +1. And you also already have access to the Shade Spell Circlet, and the Fistbreaker Helm is available in this act as well, which just passively gives you +1 to your save DC, as well as a very powerful boost to your initiative. So the Browbeaten Circlet, I think, for pure spellcasters, is going to be the third of 3 save DC boosts available, and that's assuming that you've banned Arcane Acuity, or can't use it on that particular character. And for parties that are using Arcane Acuity, then it'll come up even less. The main user for the Browbeaten Circlet would probably be a character that both wants to be in melee and casting spells, like a Pact of the Blade Warlock, or a Paladin Swordbard multiclass, and for those characters, it may be very slightly better than the Shade Spell Circlet, just a little bit easier to trigger, but for the most part, for spellcasters, it's going to be worse than any of the other save DC boosts, and for characters that are getting in melee and attacking, they have the easiest access to Arcane Acuity, so they're the least likely to actually want this effect. The Browbeaten Circlet isn't a bad item, it's actually a pretty good item, it's just that so many items available at the same time do the same thing that it does, but better, which means that I think in practice it's very rarely going to see actual play, and I'm going to put it in C tier. The Circle of Bones. The Circle of Bones gives you Animate Dead once per long rest, so you can cast Animate Dead, and it's the 3rd level version of Animate Dead, so 1 zombie or 1 skeleton, and also makes undead within 20 feet of you resistant to physical damage, so they're resistant to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing. The resistance aura is a little worse than the aura granted by the Abyss Beckoners, because that also makes them resistant to, like, a fireball or whatever, but resistance to physical damage is pretty good for the longevity of your summons, and the fact that you get a free summon out of this isn't bad. For a Necromancer, or any character really, saving a 3rd level spell slot on casting Animate Dead, just to have a little zombie guy running around with you, is a pretty reasonable use of an item slot, and saves you a pretty valuable resource. making your undead harder to kill means you'll get much more longevity out of them. They'll absorb more attacks, which is one of the things that they're best at. Your zombies are more likely to go forth and multiply because they are less likely to die immediately. So the Circle of Bones has a lot of positive knock-on effects that kind of snowball out from a very simple effect and ends up being a little more powerful than I think it looks at first glance. That being said, it's still just a resistance aura for your summons. It doesn't power up your character, so obviously if you're not a summoner, then you are less likely to want to use this, and it only works on undead, and for some reason, Shovel the Closet, even though she's not undead, the aura does work on her too, but the Circle of Bones, I think, is actually a little more interesting than you might otherwise think. It doesn't have the downsides of the Abyss Beckoners, so you can definitely use it for a Necromancer build or a Spore Druid build, but also any character can just equip this and have a resistant to physical damage zombie pet running around with them, which is actually not a terrible use of a gear slot at all. Summons are really good. You can take it off once the summon dies, and just swap to another helmet. And so I think that the Circle of Bones is actually much more interesting than it looks at first glance. I'm still going to put it in B tier because it's one that you'll sort of swap in for an encounter where a summon might be useful, or if you know that your summons are going to take a bunch of damage, and dedicated summoners may have better gear slots anyways, like they might just prefer to have higher save DCs regardless. But I actually think that this item is worth paying attention to and enables some cool strategies. If people have found, I confess it's not one that I've used a lot in actual play because it shows up relatively late, by which point the one zombie doesn't matter as much. But if people have played with this and found it more powerful, this is one I'm open to moving to A tier if you've had good experiences with it in your own play. The Circlet of Hunting. The Circlet of Hunting gives you +1 d4 to your hit chance, to your attack rolls against enemies who are affected by Hunter's Mark, Fairy Fire, Guiding Bolt, or True Strike. So it is obviously excellent because it powers up the most powerful spell in the game. By this point, you probably won't be casting Guiding Bolt or Fairy Fire that frequently, because you just have better things to do with your turns. But many rangers who have access to Hunter's Mark will still be using it pretty regularly. If you're a ranger using a two-handed bow, you may not have an amazing use for your bonus action normally, and Hunter's Mark is still a pretty relevant damage increase for ranger builds at this stage in the game, especially when that Hunter's Mark gives you a bonus to your hit chance. Being able to spend your bonus action to gain +1 d4 to hit and +1 d6 to damage on all of your attacks against an enemy is actually awesome, and the Circlet of Hunting really powers up Hunter's Mark and keeps it quite relevant on into the late game. It also does work with the legendary bow that casts Guiding Bolt on your targets, so when you have Gaunter Mail equipped, it's going to give you an extra d4 to hit those enemies in addition to the advantage that the Guiding Bolt applies. Obviously, at that point, it mostly doesn't matter, but it is kind of a cool synergy between those items. The main use for the Circlet of Hunting is for rangers who have Hunter's Mark, though, especially if you're using a two-handed bow, because that will actually increase your damage output significantly. For sharpshooter archer builds in particular, hit chance is all you care about, because all of your damage comes from sharpshooter, the special effects from your arrows, and so on. So increasing your hit chance and also your damage with Hunter's Mark is very valuable, and I value the Circlet of Hunting quite highly as a result. Hit chance is just very good in Baldur's Gate. Being able to hit your attacks is very important, and this is actually one of the best ways to do that. S tier for the Circlet of Hunting. The Circlet of Mental Anguish. This gives you, whenever an enemy fails a mental saving throw against one of your spells, so Wisdom, Charisma, or Intelligence, you heal for 1d4. This has to specifically be a spell. It doesn't work off of the Illithid powers. It doesn't work off of like Battlemaster maneuvers or Stunning Strike or anything like that. It has to be a spell or a cantrip. The coolest use of this is probably with Vicious Mockery, which is a spammable cantrip that targets a mental saving throw, so you can heal for a d4 off of your Vicious Mockeries. And it gives you a little bit of healing if you're casting a bunch of mental saving throw targeting spells. And it is worth noting that this will work on AoE spells. So if you hit an enemy with If you hit a big group of enemies with Hypnotic Pattern, you can get like 5d4 of healing off of the Circlet of Mental Anguish. But if you've had 5 enemies fail against Hypnotic Pattern, it doesn't matter if you're healing or not, because the encounter's over anyways. The fundamental problem with this circlet is that it's a defensive effect that only triggers if you've already won the encounter, because whenever an enemy fails a saving throw against a mental targeting spell, you don't cast those unless they are encounter winning, usually. So the healing doesn't matter because you're about to win combat anyways, because you've just Hypnotic Patterned the entire enemy group, or you've just banished someone with a charisma targeting save. And if you're spending spell slots on the healing, then this is a pretty bad deal, because 1d4 healing is not good. So any situation in which you would care about the healing, you won't be spending, you won't be casting one of these spells, and any situation where you're casting one of these spells, you won't care about the healing. In addition to that, it's just an incredibly minor amount of healing that you can get pretty easily for free in Baldur's Gate, so the only real interesting use case is with Vicious Mockery, and that's absolutely not worth dedicating your helmet slot to. The Circlet of Mental Anguish is just too small, too situational in effect, and inherently in effect that doesn't work that isn't relevant anytime it would actually trigger. So D tier for the Circlet of Mental Anguish just doesn't do anything, really. The Coldbrim Hat. The Coldbrim Hat inflicts 2 turns of Encrusted with Frost whenever a spell inflicts a condition on an enemy. So if you cast a spell, that spell inflicts a condition. Doesn't have to be the spell itself inflicting a condition. It can be other items that inflict conditions when you cast spells. Then you get 2 turns of Encrusted with Frost alongside your spellcast. Encrusted with Frost gives an enemy disadvantage on their saving throws, and if it stacks up to 7 turns, then they have to make a DC 12 con save, or they become frozen, which basically stuns them with a bunch of other random effects added to it. I have to start talking about this item with a mea culpa. I need to say my bad about a previous item that we talked about, the Winter's Clutches gloves. Those inflict Encrusted with Frost whenever you deal cold damage, and in my gloves tier list, I rated them very low because I said that trying to stack Encrusted with Frost up to 8 turns is basically impossible. By that time, your enemy will be dead anyways, so the frozen effect will never go off. And that is true, but what people said in the comments was, you're entirely missing the point of this item. Now, normally when I get comments that say you're entirely missing the point of this item, those comments are wrong. But in this case, I was entirely missing the point of this item. The point of the Encrusted with Frost condition is that it inflicts disadvantage on dexterity saving throws. So for the Winter's Clutches gloves, if you cast Chromatic Orb Ice on someone, dealing cold damage, they take the Encrusted with Frost condition and have disadvantage on the dex save to avoid falling prone. So it's actually very good for ice casters who are trying to knock enemies prone. I got sidetracked by the thing where you stack it up to freeze enemies, and totally missed the fact that it's just disadvantage on saving throws against ice conditions, which is very powerful. So, given that I've said all that, the Coldbrim Hat you might think I would rate a little bit higher. Unfortunately, the Coldbrim Hat comes much later in the game, and so disadvantage on ice conditions is much less interesting because you have better ways to increase your save DC at this point. It also doesn't necessarily go off on some of the spells that you want to knock enemies prone with, because they don't all inflict conditions. However, 2 turns of Encrusted with Frost added to a condition does have one interesting use, which is it's just another condition added to a spell that already inflicts a condition. So if you're trying to inflict conditions in order to trigger Radiating Orbs or Reverberation from the things that stack off of that, the Coldbrim Hat can be a viable way to do that. Typically, you'd want to stack more Radiating Orbs to trigger additional orbs or more Reverberation, because those are better conditions overall. But the Coldbrim Hat actually does have some usage for spellcasters who are trying to do condition stacking on the enemies. So basically, all of that's a very long-winded way of saying, I totally missed the point of the Encrusted with Frost condition. Unfortunately, that point doesn't really apply to this item, because disadvantage on dex saves is not super relevant at this point in the game anymore. You can just stack a save DC in other ways so that enemies fall prone, but you can still use it to stack Radiating Orb and Reverberation and so on, and so some characters may be able to get use out of this. I'm going to give it C tier because it does conflict with save DC increases, but I did want to mention that I had messed up on a previous tier list. The Covert Cowl. The Covert Cowl gives you +1 to your dex saves, requires light armor proficiency, and gives you, while obscured, the number you need to critically hit an enemy is reduced by 1. So it increases your critical hit chance by 1 if you're obscured. Note that that's obscured, so just in an unlit area, you don't have to be hiding, you just have to be in the darkness, and you increase your critical hit chance by 1. Increased critical hit is obviously pretty powerful for a bunch of builds, and many of them are often ones that want to stay in darkness because they are stealth archers or whatever who are just staying hidden and then shooting enemies, and increasing your critical hit chance on those builds is pretty powerful. For critical hit stacking builds, this also is a pretty easy effect to trigger. For example, if you are a Great Old One Warlock, then you're almost always obscured if you're in your own darkness clouds, which you almost always will be, so you can stack critical hit chance pretty easily. Basically, this reads, you have +1 to your critical hit chance. The Covert Cowl is pretty strong. Stacking critical hits is very good. It's a viable strategy and one that's pretty powerful for a couple builds, notably rogues, who can double their critical hit chance, who can double their sneak attack damage, with the Covert Cowl, if they get critical hits. Great Old One Warlocks, who can trigger the fear more often. Paladins, who can smite. A lot of characters really like getting more critical hits, and this is one of the easier ways to build that up. For those builds, this is going to be an item that you will usually have equipped. Sometimes they will want other items. Like, for example, a Rogue Ranger multiclass, I think, will probably be better off with the Circlet of Hunting, because they can use Hunter's Mark in addition to their bow shots, rather than the critical hit chance, and that will increase their damage and hit chance more than the extra chance of critical hits. A Warlock may want a save DC increasing item more than they want a critical hit chance increasing item, so the Covert Cowl is really good for the builds that it's good for, but sometimes those builds will still want a different item. For that reason, I'm going to put it in A tier, because it's just very solid. For crit chance stacking builds, obviously, it's very important. But some versions of those builds may want something different, so A tier. And one reason the Covert Cowl is A tier is the Dark Justiciar helmet, not to be confused with the Dark Justiciar Helm. Incidentally, it drives me nuts that the Dark Justiciar gear has so many items that are named exactly the same thing or minor variations and just have different rarities of the item. It makes it really hard to tell them apart. But the DJ helmet, aside from being my, let's say, Weird Al style sci-fi parody group, is a helmet that gives you +1 to your Constitution saving throws, +1 to your saving throws against spells, which stacks with +1 to your con saves. So if a spell targets your con save, it'll give you +2 against that. And while obscured, you have +1 to your critical hit chance, so the identical effect to the Covert Cowl. Now, this does require medium armor proficiency, which not every build that wants to build critical hit chance will have. A Warlock may not, a Rogue may not have medium armor proficiency, though many of them will multiclass in ways that they will get that effect, and of course a Paladin will prefer the Dark Justiciar helmet over the Covert Cowl. But for the most part, this is an item that many characters will be interested in. +1 to your saving throws is pretty good, and increasing your critical hit chance stacking is also pretty good, but it does have a similar situation where a lot of those builds will still prefer a different helmet. The main thing that holds this back is that the main bonus, the saving throw bonus, is purely defensive and only works against spells, so it won't protect you against some things that aren't classified as spells that require you to make saving throws. And also, the characters that want the saving throw bonus may not want the crit chance bonus. Now, the DJ helmet is very good for rangers in particular, who stacking saving throws is one of the only things that they need. If you're like a Gloomstalker ranger, you are very hard to kill through physical damage, and you have bonuses to your saving throws, so stacking those even higher can make you almost impossible to kill. But the Dark Justiciar helmet overall just gives you a powerful set of advantages. I think a lot of characters will have other options that they prefer, but it's still going to show up in a lot of builds, so again, I'm going to put it in A tier. Next up, the Fistbreaker Helm. The Fistbreaker Helm gives you +1 to your spell save DC, and +1 to your initiative. What do spellcasters need? They need spell save DC, and they need initiative. This gives you two incredibly powerful stats that synergize extremely well, both in the same item. +1 to your initiative means that you're more likely to go first, and +1 to your save DC means that your turns are more likely to stop the enemies from taking a turn. D&D at its core is a game about stopping your enemies from taking meaningful turns, and the Fistbreaker Helm helps you do that. This item just feels so good to use in actual play, because it just makes your character so much more effective, just all the time, forever. It's not conditional, it's just passive benefits constantly. It makes you so much better at doing what you're trying to do with just about any character that would consider putting it on. I think I mentioned that the Sentinel Shield is one of my probably most equipped items in the entire game. The Fistbreaker Helm is right up there as well. I think basically every party I've played has had the Fistbreaker Helm equipped 100% of the time it was available to equip, because this item is just going to always be relevant and always be super powerful. Now, if you're doing a lot of Arcane Acuity stacking, you may want one of the Arcane Acuity items instead, because they give you a much bigger bonus to your save DC. But for any party that's not using Arcane Acuity or can't stack it easily, because you have characters that can't stack Arcane Acuity easily, the Fistbreaker Helm is going to be incredibly powerful. Just a great item overall, two great stats that go great together. Fistbreaker Helm is S tier. The Flawed Helldusk Helmet. The Flawed Helldusk Helmet gives you +1 to your con saves, because it's a medium armor helmet, and +2 to your saving throws against spells. Similar to the DJ helmet, this only applies to things that are actually spells, not any saving throw effects that don't originate from spells, but if there's a spell that targets your Constitution save, it's a total of a +3 bonus to that con save. The main use for this item is for a character that is really hard to kill through physical damage, but needs a boost to their mental saving throws to increase to their wisdom saving throw typically. But those characters may prefer the Helmet of Autonomy, which gives you a bigger bonus to your wisdom saves. Obviously, the Flawed Helldusk Helmet also gives you a bonus to your other saving throws, so it might be better in some encounters. The Helmet of Autonomy might be better in other encounters, but it's pretty close between those two. The thing about the Flawed Helldusk Helmet is it's actually a very good item. It's a very solid item in and of itself. So in a vacuum, this item is really nice. But when you compare it to the other items that do the same or similar things, other defensive helmets, it tends to lose out. The Helmet of Autonomy is better for characters that just need a wisdom save increase, and don't need like a charisma or intelligence save increase, which most characters don't. And the Dark Justiciar helmet is better for characters that want that saving throw increase, but also care about their critical hit chance. And chances are a character that is looking to shore up its weakness against wisdom saving throws does care about its critical hit chance, because it's just going to be a physical damage character, most likely. That leaves the Flawed Helldusk Helmet as a very good item, but one that mostly doesn't have a home, because a lot of characters just have better options available to them that fill roughly the same niche. That being said, it is just a good item, so you can just put it on anybody and you won't be unhappy. I'm going to give it B tier, because often in sort of specific actual choices that you're making, you will have better options than the Flawed Helldusk Helmet. But I will say that for a B tier item, you can just give this to anyone and it won't hurt your party. Because it's a very good item in a vacuum. The only reason I'm putting it in B tier is just that it is outcompeted in its niche by a couple other options. The Hat of Fire Acuity. So I went back and forth for a bit on how to rate the Arcane Acuity items in this tier list. In other words, should I like give them their own tier? Should they have their own S+ tier? Should I talk about them all together? Should I talk about them separately? I decided to rate them just as normal items, but I'm going to talk about Arcane Acuity as an effect before I rate the first Arcane Acuity item. Arcane Acuity is whenever you fulfill a condition. In the case of the Hat of Fire Acuity, it's dealing fire damage, but it depends on the item that provides it. You gain stacks of Arcane Acuity, usually 2 stacks of Arcane Acuity, and you have +1 to your save DC and +1 to your spell attacks for each stack remaining. For the Hat of Fire Acuity in particular, you can use Scorching Ray to deal multiple instances of fire damage all in the same turn, and stack your Arcane Acuity to maximum instantly. But all of the Arcane Acuity hats will give you usually like 4 stacks immediately, increasing your save DCs by 4 and your spell attacks by 4. I'm going to take a moment to soapbox here. Arcane Acuity was a design mistake and a really bad one. It is one of the, I would say, 4 most broken mechanics in Baldur's Gate 3, the others being Strength Elixirs, Tavern Brawler, and the Wet condition. Arcane Acuity completely bypasses the normal difficulty curve of the game by allowing you to stack your save DC to values that are just completely outside the intended balance of the game. And I think of the 4 broken mechanics that I mentioned, it's by far the worst because its play pattern is extremely not fun. If you use Arcane Acuity, then you just bypass encounters by shutting down enemies before they start, because you've got like +10 to your save DCs. The bosses cannot pass, and because enemies don't have critical successes on saving throws in Baldur's Gate, you can get 100% accuracy on your spells. And those spells can lock down enemies, preventing them from ever acting, meaning you don't have to engage with the game when you play with Arcane Acuity. All those other effects have cool things that can happen. Like, for a casual player, throwing an enemy at another enemy or throwing a fish at an enemy with Tavern Brawler is really fun. But Arcane Acuity doesn't really apply to casual players because you have to dive through like 4 tooltips to even understand what it does. So only really enfranchised players are ever going to even encounter the mechanic. And when they do, they'll quickly realize that it is the best thing that they can be doing for that character, start doing it, and optimize all the fun out of the game for themselves. It's a truism in game design. I think it's a Sid Meier quote that given the chance, players will optimize all of the fun out of a game. Arcane Acuity is one of the easiest ways to do that, because as soon as you start stacking it, enemies stop passing saving throws, meaning that you never actually play the encounter. I think you will have way more fun playing Baldur's Gate if you ban use of the Arcane Acuity items for yourself. But if you just want to win Honor Mode, you will have a much easier time if you use the Arcane Acuity items. For a Fire Sorcerer stacking the Hat of Fire Acuity, the save DC increases and the hit chance increases means you will never miss with your Scorching Rays, so you will deal amazing amounts of damage, and then you can subsequently like quicken a control spell to lock down anything that's still standing in the encounter. You can stack it up incredibly easily because Scorching Ray lets you do multiple instances of fire damage. And then for any other character, obviously this is intended for a Fire Sorcerer, but for any other character, it's pretty easy to just get sources of fire damage. You can hit an enemy twice with a torch using extra attack, and then in a subsequent turn, cast a control spell to lock down the entire encounter. And it's just very easy to trigger Arcane Acuity and absolutely overwhelming for enemies when you do. Enemies who cannot pass their saving throws are not threats, and the Arcane Acuity stacking items allow you to get to the point where enemies are not threats very, very quickly, almost instantly with a lot of builds. And so the Hat of Fire Acuity, of course, is S tier, both for builds that are built around using it, and also you can just randomly stick it on anyone who's doing fire damage and casting spells, like say a Fiend Warlock with Wall of Fire will stack their Eldritch Blast hit chance up immensely with the Hat of Fire Acuity, and will stack their ability to cast Command up immensely with the Hat of Fire Acuity, so you'll just lock down entire encounters immediately. This is the easiest of the 3 to trigger. You don't even have to really build around it at all, and incredibly powerful. So the Arcane Acuity items are just busted and will absolutely let you cruise to victory. If you want to win the game, beeline for these items. The Hat of Storm Scion's Power. The Hat of Storm Scion's Power gives you stacks of Arcane Acuity whenever you deal thunder damage. So exactly the same as the Hat of Fire Acuity, but it's thunder damage, still for 2 turns of Arcane Acuity stacks. It's a little harder to use because there's no thunder version of Scorching Ray, so you can't just cast one spell to instantly stack your Hat of Storm Scion's Power to maximum, unless you hit a bunch of enemies in an AoE like Thunder Wave or whatever. And you can't just dip a weapon in fire, in thunder, the way you can dip a weapon in fire. So there are fewer ways to apply thunder damage than there are fire damage easily and for free. So you have to build around this item a little more, than you do around the Hat of Fire Acuity. There's a couple ways around this. Weapons that deal thunder damage on hit, like Nyrolna or the Drakethroat Glaive, can be used to imbue your weapon with thunder damage to stack Arcane Acuity whenever you attack with a weapon. If you're a Tempest Cleric, you get a bunch of free thunder damage occasionally, so you can get extra thunder damage, and of course you can use thunder damage from spells like Destructive Wave or Thunder Wave in order to stack the Hat of Storm Scion's Power. This is just as broken as the other Arcane Acuity items, but mostly if you're trying to do a spellcaster who's stacking Arcane Acuity, you want the Hat of Fire Acuity, and if you're trying to do a weapon user who's stacking Arcane Acuity, you want the helmet. But the Hat of Storm Scion's Power can still be just as busted if you have a character built around doing thunder damage, so I wouldn't overlook this item. It is an alternative way to stack Arcane Acuity on multiple characters, and you can use the Drakethroat Glaive in combination with this to basically get 2 helmets of Arcane Acuity, which is really powerful for any party. You can use a Tempest Cleric alongside this to do a bunch of thunder damage and stack their save DCs super high. In general, I'm going to give it A tier, although this is a kind of weird A tier because it's better than a lot of the helmets in S tier. It's just that overall, if you're trying to do Arcane Acuity stacking, the other 2 helmets are better are mostly easier to use. But if you're trying to Arcane Acuity stack with multiple characters in your party, the Hat of Storm Scion's Power is a very good item. And if you just want to boost the save DC on your Tempest Cleric, it's very good. It also can just be useful if you just like the look of it better than the Helmet of Arcane Acuity. The Hat of Uninhibited Kushigo. This gives you, after dealing damage with an unarmed attack, you gain +1 to your spell save DC until the end of your turn. And it's 1 turn duration, so you have to cast a spell on that turn in order to benefit from this effect. That means you need to either be hasted or be a monk who can attack with a Flurry of Blows attack as a bonus action in order to benefit from the Hat of Uninhibited Kushigo. It also doesn't stack like Arcane Acuity, so you only get +1 to your save DC off of this. If you're doing some sort of monk spellcaster multiclass, you're going to be way better off using the Gloves of Cinder and Sizzle that do fire damage when you do an unarmed attack, alongside the Hat of Fire Acuity, or any other thing that just increases your save DC, like the Shadespell Circlet, for example, will just give you constant save DC increases, and that's if you're doing some sort of weird monk spellcaster multiclass where you're actually casting spells. I think the intention here is for 4 Elements monks to use this, because the 4 Elements monk spells do use your spell save DC, so you get an extra +1 to your save DC off of that on those. But 4 Elements monks mostly don't cast spells that actually have save DC because they don't have the stats to have high enough save DC for it. And if they wanted to, they could stack Arcane Acuity with the hat. And so the Hat of Uninhibited Kushigo is for a very, very narrow subset of builds and doesn't really even work for them because the duration is only 1 turn, so you have to both make the unarmed attack and cast the spell in the same turn, meaning you can only ever do it with a bonus action attack. Overall, this is just too many hoops to jump through for a bonus that's a real bonus, but one that's duplicated by a lot of other things in much better ways. D tier for the Uninhibited Kushigo hat. The Helmet of Arcane Acuity. This gives you +1 to your dex saves, and whenever you deal damage with a weapon attack, you gain 2 stacks of Arcane Acuity. This is the one you usually see in sort of the most broken builds in Baldur's Gate 3. This is the most common of the Arcane Acuity items to see a lot of usage in build optimization videos, including my own, because it's so easy to trigger the effect. All you need is any weapon attack, which can be a sword bard firing arrows, it can be a paladin whacking things, it can be a Pact of the Blade Warlock stabbing things, it can be whatever, and you gain Arcane Acuity stacks. The combo here is with the Ring, the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, that lets you then cast an enchantment or illusion spell as a bonus action after you make a weapon attack. So you make 2 weapon attacks, gain 4 stacks of Arcane Acuity, then use your bonus action to cast Command or Hypnotic Pattern or whatever and knock every other enemy out of the fight with save DCs high enough that they can't resist it. The Helmet of Arcane Acuity, we've all seen it in a million builds. It's obviously broken in a ridiculous number of ways. Even if you aren't building around it with the Band of the Mystic Scoundrel, you can cast your spell with haste. So you can use your first action to make 2 weapon attacks and your second hasted action to cast the spell with +4 to your save DCs. You can also just use your spells in subsequent turns with massive save DC bonuses, and that's still just fine. Helmet of Arcane Acuity, broken just like all the Arcane Acuity items, and one of the ones that's very, very easy to use, so S tier. The Marksmanship Hat. The Marksmanship Hat gives you +1 to your attack rolls with ranged weapons and throwing weapons. For thrown weapon characters, +1 to your attack rolls mostly doesn't matter, because thrown weapon characters will mostly be Tavern Brawler characters who don't need bonuses to hit, because they hit 95% of the time anyways. But for ranged characters, +1 to your hit chance is very good. That being said, a lot of ranged characters have better options. For a ranger, the Circlet of Hunting will be better than the Marksmanship Hat, because you will often want to be hunter's marking things that you are then going to shoot. And for a rogue, the Covert Cowl, or even the Dark Justiciar helmet may be better, because critical hit chance may actually be better for you than +1 to your hit chance, depending on exactly how you structured your build. For the most part, I think that most rogues, ranged rogues, are going to prefer the critical hit chance, because boosting your sneak attack damage is so powerful. Rangers will prefer the Circlet of Hunting. The Marksmanship Hat can be useful for non-rogue or ranger archers, like, for example, a swords bard or a fighter who is doing ranged combat. But again, those characters may have better options, like the crit chance from the Dark Justiciar helmet, for a sword bard, like the Helmet of Arcane Acuity. So the Marksmanship Hat, while it gives you a pretty relevant bonus that's actually worth using, just like the Flawed Helldusk helmet, I think is typically outcompeted in its niche by other items that do very similar things that most characters who would want this effect will prefer. That being said, again, this is a very solid bonus, and if you just put it on any ranged character, you won't be unhappy, but most of the time I think you're going to find that this helmet slot is outcompeted for by other more powerful helmets in the same niche. So B tier for the Marksmanship Hat, but again, you certainly won't be sad if you put this on. Alright, my friends, that is all of the Act 2 helmets. It's funny, actually, that all the Act 2 helmets are in the first half of the alphabet. M is the latest helmet in Act 2, the Marksmanship Hat. And the Act 2 helmets are just so strong. As you saw, we placed so many of them in the top tiers, and even the ones that I put in B tier are pretty good, like the Circle of Bones, the Flawed Helldusk helmet, the Marksmanship Hat. All of these are actually pretty good items. It's just that there's so much competition for your helmet slot in Act 2, because there's so many very, very powerful helmets, and of course the Act 1 helms are often still very relevant. Of course, the story of the Act 2 helms is the broken power of Arcane Acuity, but you also get a bunch of really solid items for a bunch of other strategies. Any character that wants defenses and more spell saves can use the Dark Justiciar helmet or the Flawed Helldusk helmet. Any character that wants to boost their critical hit chance now gets a bunch of options to do that, and ranged characters get a really powerful option in the Circlet of Hunting. For the most part, a lot of your melee martial characters will either equip the Dark Justiciar helmet if you don't have someone who particularly needs it, or just stick with the Haste Helm. The Haste Helm or the Grimskull Helm are still just excellent options to have equipped, and your spellcasters have now gotten powered up beyond the point of reason, or even just significantly if you decide not to use Arcane Acuity and just stick with the Fistbreaker Helm. Fistbreaker Helm is also just good for any spellcaster that can't use Arcane Acuity stacking easily. That is also, unfortunately, all the time I have to record today. This video did go kind of long because I ranted about Arcane Acuity for like 5 solid minutes. But we will be back with Act 3, and so I hope that you enjoyed this look at the Act 2 helmets. And of course, as always, if you have, feel free to leave a comment and like the video. Helps me out with the algorithm. Let me know if you think there's anything I missed or anything I should move around in terms of how these helmets actually play out in your games. Definitely always open to moving things around, and as you heard, I already talked about one item that I got wrong in a previous tier list. Definitely open to doing that more in future tier lists. As always, my friends, you can subscribe to my channel for more of this and other strategy game content. Thank you for watching. I'll catch you next time.